Funny thing about watching television, people watch it in different sorts of ways. People are on it in different sorts of ways too. You know, a few years ago, I'm watching the news on the telly in Italy. And there's a reporter, and he's standing outside a small church with a microphone because a painting's just been ripped off from inside the church. Somebody's nicked a Titian painting. Now, I'm looking at that television, and I'm thinking, that's sad. That was a great little painting. It was in that church. If they ever get it back, they'll have to go in a museum, and it will be with a dozen other Titians in a row, like a catalogue, like a bloody refugee. It's lost its place in the world. And that's sad. You can't keep paintings in churches anymore. Now, I'm thinking that looking at the telly. Meanwhile, on the film, the camera's moving off the reporter onto a group of the village women. And they're all standing there glaring at the camera. And they look at the camera, and honestly, the tears were rolling down their face. And they looked at the camera and they said, she was our virgin. They've taken our virgin. What have they done? And I suddenly thought, my God, that's a strange attitude. I mean, for me, it's a painting. It's a sad thing. It's a sort of aesthetic thing. This painting's been stolen. That's a great shame, you know. But for these people, that was a painting they've been baptized and buried under for hundreds of years. The beauty in the painting was the beauty of their virgin. Now, the difference between them and me is the difference, you might say, between a profane attitude and a sacred attitude. I have a profane attitude. I'm looking at the Virgin and thinking she's a beautiful painting. They're looking at a beautiful painting and thinking she is the Virgin. Now, that difference in looking and seeing is what's changed the Bible. The story of the Bible over the last 100 years is really how it's gone from being a sacred object to a profane one. How it's gone from having golden covers on it to being a paperback. This change was a part of the biggest change the West has ever seen, from a sacred to a profane world. It changed the way that man looked at the universe, the way he looked at God and the order of his society. Like most avalanches, it's difficult to see quite how it started. For me, though, the moment was in the 14th century, on a day in April, when that most gentle man, the poet Petrarch, climbed a mountain in the south of France.
On the appointed day, we left the house, and by evening reached Malocène, which lies at the foot of the mountain on the north side. We rested there a day, and finally this morning made the ascent with no one except 2 servants. And it is a most difficult task indeed, for the mountain is a very steep and almost inaccessible mass of rocky terrain. But as a poet once put it well, remorseless labor conquers all.
Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux in 1336, and he was 32 years old. He's a very stylish young man. His father had died and left him a bit of a family fortune. He was already a poet, writing verses to the great love of his life, the enigmatic Laura. Though when you read his verses, you think he was more in love with Petrarch and poetry than any woman. Anyway, he liked good food, banquets, companionship of friends, and the countryside, which he spent most of his life. But when he came up here, certainly he already had the beginnings of the international reputation, really. You could say, in fact, that he was really on the threshold of his own life, his own experience. The world was really at his feet.
At first, because I was not accustomed to the quality of the air and the effect of the wide expanse of view spread out before me, I stood there like a dazed person. I could see the clouds under our feet, and the tales I had read of Athos and Olympus seemed less incredible.
Petrarch says that when he got to the top of Mount Ventoux, he whipped a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions out of his pocket, copy he always carried with him everywhere, and read that God was not to be found at the top of mountains, but in men's hearts. Actually, first of all, he talks about its sweet and sonorous words. Consider his journey. It started off because he'd read a classical text about Alexander the Great going to the top of a mountain, and he felt he wanted to do the same. It finished with him rushing back to his little village from where he started and writing a great long letter about this wonderful trip up a mountain. The journey was as revolutionary for Europe as a missionary turning up in an Amazonian tribe would be for the tribe itself. It's funny how books, you think, might have made that. What they've done for him, of course, is removed him from experience, from the ordinary experience of daily life. For most people, after all, mountains were dangerous places. There was nothing up there. The shepherd might come up to look for his lost sheep. A forester might look down to see where he's got more trees to cut. A general might come up here to marshal an army, something like that. That was experience. But Petrarch's imagination and his energy had taken these old texts and projected him up the mountain, and it actually created a new sort of consciousness, a new self-awareness. 500 or 600 years later, of course, that detachment from the real world, which is now built inside of people, creates a large part of what we call the sort of loneliness of modern man. For his own society, over the next few hundred years, Petrarch's new vision of the world was totally revolutionary, both for society and for the Bible. Petrarch's world, of course, was the Gothic world. Even from the top of Mount Ventoux, it was the only world he could have seen, the only world he knew. This was a world with a precise order, a divine order. All men, from kings to peasants, lived and died inside precise circles of influence and status. And this was all part of a divine order made by God and established during the 7 days of creation. What kept all this in place, of course, was the ultimate deterrent, the last judgment. God's trial of men that will be conducted, so the book of Revelation says, in the world's last days. With a sweep of his hand, he sends the damned to hell. Being good in Gothic society was rather different from being good today. God sent people like wicked priests and princes to hell, not simply because they were sinners, but because their sins muddled and attacked his divine order. Later on, of course, all these torments were recreated on earth. The fire, the ovens, the disemboweling, the whole lot, as men set out to police the divine order for themselves. In Petrarch's day, this was still an unnameable terror, but it's stayed a part of the European vision ever since. Petrarch's place in his divine order, in the circles of influence in the medieval world, was that of poet and of scholar. Above all, he loved books. He called his library, which was the first private library in Europe, his daughter. He wanted to give it to one Italian town intact when he died. For the people of the town, it would have been the first public library in Europe. Unfortunately, the books were sold off one by one. Now they're all over the world. The Vatican has just these 2 of them. When you open them, you still get a bit of gust of the man himself. See the beautiful, neat columns of a professional scribe. Down the side, you see, as a professional, every column, every paragraph is nicely titled in that dull red. And there, look, In between the dull red, that crabby little scholarly, amateur almost, handwriting, was the hand of Petrarch himself. There he is. He's still up there, looking at the prose, looking down on the world, thinking, I wonder if that is right, I wonder if that is wrong. I'll make a note about that. That's a new way of looking at books. Now, the other manuscript, that is yet more amazing. It's a very fine example of medieval bookmaking. Exquisite collection of ancient texts. You can feel the sacredness in the words. That sacredness that really Petrarch was about to attack. You see, he spent most of his life going around monasteries in France and Germany and Italy, looking at medieval manuscripts, trying to track down the classical world because nobody read this stuff anymore. Petrarch was really the first man to examine classical writing in hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, it wasn't just that easy. You didn't just read it. These texts are often written by fairly bored scribes, and sometimes they're a bit wrong, they're garbled, the scribe goes off on a tangent or whatever. But Petrarch's job, he thought, was to sit down and try and retrieve the original text. And here he is working out exactly what the Roman Cicero said. Now, he didn't stop there. When he got the original text, he then tried to find out what the Roman Cicero had been like. And then he sat down and wrote an article on Cicero the man. That was a really marvellous thing. He felt friendly with the past. He says one day when a book fell off a shelf in his library and hit his foot, he wondered why his friend Homer, was the title of the book, was angry with him. He knew these old people. Now, that profound way of looking at books, which was quite new and quite different, in 150 years paid off incredibly. An Englishman called John